position we haven't talked about, I don't think, nearly enough this offseason. We just look at it and say it's a developmental piece. It's a piece of the Pittsburgh Steelers that in 2025, you're going to see what you get, and then you're going to hope for the best. And if nothing else, you're hoping for the future to look much brighter than it is right now with the guys that are in place. Well, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette's Ray Fittipaldo says that that might not be the case, that the Pittsburgh Steelers are not expected to hand the starting job to right guard Mason McCormick and instead plan to bring in some competition. And that comes with many questions, two very big ones. Is he the pole position starter? And if he is not, if this is real competition that the Pittsburgh Steelers are looking to bring in, what is the level of that competition? Because it varies. You could bring in another Mason McCormick. They have one on the bench. His name's Spencer Anderson. Why wouldn't you give him the opportunity to compete with Mason for the starting job? And if that's not enough, what are you looking for? Because it could go as high as Trey Smith and say, we're going to get a superstar. You could go get a guy like Mekhi Becton out of Philadelphia if he hits the free agency market and say, this guy is not a Trey Smith, but he had a very good season at a new position. Maybe that's the guy that we're looking for. Or maybe you just go out and draft somebody. Or maybe you try to bring back James Daniels. I think there are a bunch of options. I'll ask you, Mason McCormick, is Spencer, if it's not Spencer Anderson, how high are you shooting if you're the Pittsburgh Steelers?
I think James Daniels coming back would be probably the best option for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Like, let's not forget, he didn't have a great start the last season before the injury, but the year prior, he was probably their best offensive lineman. And I wouldn't be surprised if he comes back and becomes one of the best backup offensive linemen you could have. I mean, this guy was playing at a high level. And if you bring him back to be competition, potentially to be the backup by the midway point of the season, if Mason McCormick kind of wrestles the job back from him, I think that's a really good place to be if you're the Steelers. We saw what happened last year. You need depth. So the fact that they might go out and get more depth should not surprise anybody, especially after the Senior Bowl when we heard them having rave reviews about Gray Zabel out of Dakota State. But bringing back James Daniels would make some sense, especially because he's coming off that injury. I'm sure he's not going to cost you an arm and a leg. And when it comes to backups in this league, you could do a lot worse than James Daniels. And I'm not saying that to compare it to what we talked about yesterday with Daniel Jones. I actually believe that James Daniels is a good option for the Steelers to come in and not just be the backup, but potentially, if need be the starter, because he's done it for multiple years.
Yeah, to be very honest, though, I don't think James Daniels, you don't think James Daniels would get a starting gig with most teams that need a guard this offseason?
Potentially.
I think if he doesn't get hurt, he's the second biggest name on the market this offseason because he's only 26 years old.
Well, I mean, if that's the case, then that's the level. That answers your question. How high are you willing to go? If James Daniels is number 2, I'm willing to go as high as number 1, because if you're already at number 2, why not go to number 1?
I agree. I could see the Pittsburgh Steelers bringing James Daniels back for a reasonable deal. I don't expect this to happen, but I was kind of thrown off by the Mason McCormick thing. So I'm reacting to this as everybody else is. And I can see James Daniels being an option for the Steelers. I think it's less likely, especially because Ray Fittipaldo reports that there's probably going to be competition, and Jerry Dulac says James Daniels is not going to come back. Chances are they know the same people. They're talking to the same people. They're talking to each other because they work for the same place. So that one, was a bit confusing, or I guess maybe less likely just in my own mind.
Mm-hmm.
But I could see James Daniels coming back for like a reasonable deal, and the Steelers giving Mason McCormick another year to develop, and then saying next year, after you mature behind James Daniels, which is what you were supposed to do last year, you become the starter on the left side for Isaac Seumalo, and that gives the Steelers a good starting line now, depth with Spencer Anderson and Mason McCormick. You probably still bring back like a Ryan McCollum or a Nate Herbig as your backup center. And then a year from now, you move Mason into the starting lineup. I could see that happening. It also moves Mason back to his natural position on the left side, which I'm a big fan of. And I think James Daniels is good. The bounce back from the Achilles is a total mystery. Nobody has any idea. I mean, you look at some guys, it takes years. You look at some guys, it takes 1 year, and that's a 350-pound man, who's supposed to be athletic. That is very difficult to do. But I could see it as an option. Are you against Mason McCormick being on the bench this season?
I wouldn't say I'm against it. I like the fact that they're going to bring in some competition because last year I thought he held his own very well, certainly better than I expected. But there were games where you looked at it and you said, well, he looks like a fourth round rookie.
Yes.
And I understand that the jump from year 1 to year 2 is usually a substantial one. But if you're the Steelers, what's the one thing you need to key in on this offseason? Making sure that this offensive line, these young pieces that you have that have really high ceilings, pan out. And if you just continue to kind of bash your head against a wall, especially like you mentioned, in the wrong position on the wrong side, that's not always the best way to get the most out of your draft pick. So if they're going to bring in somebody else for him to compete with and then potentially end up shifting him over, which we seem to have this conversation about pretty much everybody except for Zach Frazier, then I'm certainly not against that.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I'm honestly I'm okay with it. I think Mason McCormick deserves at least a shot to be the starter in 2025. I think it's not a bad thing necessarily if your expectations are aligned correctly, that in 2025 he's your starter. I'd be okay with that. I really would. I would also kind of be okay with McCormick moving over if Isaac Seumalo, who I don't think should be gone, was to be released as a cap casualty, and then you try to re-sign James Daniels. I like Mason McCormick, and I do think he's the future. I think it could work out in the Steelers' favor that James Daniels is young enough. He could also be the future. I mean, he's 2 years older. That's crazy to say. He's 2 years older than Mason McCormick and Zach Frazier. That's actually super nuts because he's been in the league for, I believe, 5 years at this point. And I think that allows you to have 4 guys, hopefully with Broderick Jones being your 5th, to develop nicely. And right now you're only paying one of them, hopefully, for kind of cheap. I don't think I'm super opposed to it. I'm interested to see where they go, though, because I can't sit here and say that there's a name in my head that makes sense for the Steelers to bring in as competition. I also don't know, in my eyes, if you bring an outside name in, James Daniels is different. But if you bring an outside name in that was a starter last year somewhere in the NFL, it gives me Russ Kenny Pickett vibes of the guy that you just brought in is clearly going to be the starter, but you're going to tell Mason McCormick that it's competition. You draft a first round Gray Zabel, gives me the same vibes. That's, Troy Fautanu, Broderick Jones. That's what it looks like to me. James Daniels, a guy who hasn't started in the NFL yet. Okay, that's real competition for Mason McCormick. I still think James Daniels walks away the winner in that competition if he's healthy, but I think that that's the closest thing you'd get to real competition for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And it go the other way around too. If you draft a 4th round guard, Mason McCormick is your starting right guard in 2025, So I don't know where the line is, but I'm interested to see where it falls out.